Hey there, Michael Mullen. Super excited to be part of this virtual recovery and sleep summit that Nick Lamb's put together. Pretty humbled to be part of this amazing group of presenters that can provide great content for you over the course of these 2 days. I'd like to talk about respiration and breath work and the influence it has not only on recovery and sleep, but also on a lot of other aspects of our body's function. Respiration affects every single system in our body, and it is something that we don't even think about that much during our daytime, and many people take for granted. What I'd like to do is create a platform for which you have a better understanding of the mechanics, the big players, and ways that you can create intervention strategies to allow you to be as successful as you can for yourself, as well as the clients that you see and influence. First, I'd like to talk about the anatomy. I want you to think of the 3 big bony structures that are all part of our respiration. The cranium, the thorax or rib cage, and the pelvis. These 3 bony structures all have critical influence on the ability of our body to be able to pass air through it most effectively. We'll speak mostly about the canister, the top of the rib cage to the bottom of the pelvis, because that's where the most likely mechanisms take place that things can go awry. That being said, the cranium plays a pretty valuable role in being able to allow this to function ideally. Because if we're not able to get inhalation through the nose, which we'll talk a little bit about, to be able to allow cranial expansion, to warm the air and filter the air effectively, then that will affect the way that our body is able to take in the oxygen that we need ideally for it to function. First, let's talk about the rib cage. This incredibly dynamic structure, by design, has many different shapes, sizes, and forms depending upon the individual. It's incredibly pliable, and its pliability is what allows us to have movement take place externally, but also internally, so that respiration can occur and allow optimal expansion and collapse to take place through this incredibly dynamic structure. As we can see, depending upon the position people are in, and depending upon what movements they're introducing to their system, will influence what happens internally. Meaning, the diaphragm can begin to change its resting position and shape and structure depending upon the positions that we assume most regularly during our daytime. The diaphragm can get tipped, torqued, twisted, pulled, concentric, eccentric, all of the above, depending upon the given scenario of the individual, as well as other stressors of their life, both physical as well as cognitively. If this happens over the course of time often enough, then actual shape change will take place, further contributing to the dysfunction. During the inhalation process, as the diaphragm is descending down and the lungs are expanding and negative pressure is pulling air into the lungs for optimal respiration internally, there's a mechanism of the movement of the downward pull of that diaphragm pushing down on our organs that's supposed to allow ideal pumping and pressures to take place inside. If we lose the ideal mechanism of this diaphragm's descension and expansion capabilities of this upper thorax, then the body will begin to compensate in a host of different ways. You'll see different shapes of people assuming different positions of rib cages that have become straightened or stiffened, or rib cages that have become overly kyphotic over time, or develop sway back positions. Those that do a lot of heavy lifting and training, do a lot of performance work, creates a lot of tension on the system, a lot of contractive natures of muscles, stiffening the rib cage, not allowing it to move ideally. But yet during the daytime, 22 to 24,000 times a day, the brain and body are still going to move air, and it's going to try to figure out a way to do that that's ideal enough for it to be able to stay alive. This survival instinct or mechanism that it puts into place creates further compensation strategies that the body will begin to develop over time. The brain thinks it's normal. It can't recognize what's feeling because the baseline has elevated. A baseline of imbalanced breathing becomes the new norm. The brain recognizes it, the body recognizes it, the nervous system certainly feels what's going on, and homeostasis becomes farther and farther from reality. At the bottom of this anatomical canister that we talked about is the pelvis. And it's important to note that although bony and much firmer in structure than that rib cage is, there's an incredibly dynamic nature of it that needs to take place during the breathing process. During inhalation, as the pelvis opens, there should be expansive capabilities, much like the rib cage. These two ilium have a tendency to orient and push forward just a little bit during inhalation. That is offset by a sacrum that has it counter-nutates in the opposite direction during inhalation. All of that allows for the descent of the pelvic floor musculature to be able to allow the organs pushing down into this basin to accept those contents, but with control. This highly refined and complex mechanism of expansion, little anterior tent, posterior counternutation of the sacrum, descent of the bottom of the pelvic floor musculature, eccentrically but with control, is what balances the base of that canister. Again, if we can take you back to the shape of the egg that we talked about before, there should be this fairly even upper thoracic expansion, abdominal cavity expansion, pelvic cavity expansion, all creating a balanced egg shape. Over the course of time, as the body gets used to these changes in an ideal way, by optimizing breathwork strategies, which we'll talk about in just a little bit, this is what allows ideal homeostasis, or balance, of the body, the brain, and all the systems. So how does the cranium fit into all of this? Well, as I mentioned earlier, as we inhale, ideally we inhale through our nose. This process warms the air, filters the air, slows down the inhalation process, mixes with a really important chemical called nitric oxide that's produced in our nasopharynx that optimizes homeostasis of the respiratory system as the gas enters our lungs, but also periodically as we swallow, the bolus of the saliva goes into our digestive system and aids in digestive health as well too. We bypass that when we mouth breathe. There is an expansive property that should take place of the cranium during inhalation, which again happens when we inhale through the nose, which we don't get when we breathe through the mouth. This dynamic nature of this skull expansion and collapse that takes place is what helps to optimize cerebral, spinal, and arterial flow through the cranium. The cerebral spinal fluid, which is produced in our brain, it bathes our brain throughout the daytime and nighttime. It goes all the way around our brain to the very, very bottom of our spinal cord and tailbone, all the way back up. And what I have you think about is this constant pump that's happening of this cerebral spinal fluid. There's also arterial and venous fluid movement that should be taking place inside the veins and the arteries. There's also fluid movement throughout our organs and through our fascial system and fascial network. So as I talk about respiration, whether it's regards to breathwork activities, interventions, or recovery, I want you to think pumps, and I want you to think pressures, and I want you to think fluid movement. The more you create these images in your head versus just the breathing mechanics aspect of things, the better you'll be at understanding and appreciating the intervention strategies and the successes you'll have with them. The diaphragm, or the big D, is a critical component of the respiratory system. It does 75 to 80% of the work of inhalation. What I want you to do when you picture the diaphragm is I want you to picture there's two aspects. There's the dome part that is inside our rib cage that covers our organs, that during inhalation, which is the active state of contracting of the diaphragm, as it pushes down on our organs, there's an attachment that attaches down to our lumbar spine as well. That's called the crura, or the crus of the diaphragm. During inhalation, it's the crus or the crura that attaches to the front of our spine internally that is most active doing the pulling of contracting the diaphragm to pull that parachute down. As it descends downward and lungs fill with air, there's an expansive quality that should take place of our abdominal region and pelvic region as well too. The abdomen should expand with control. The pelvic floor and basin of that canister should fill, but with control. I want people to think about during the expansive or inhalation process, while things are opening, that there's an eccentric element that's taking place of the muscles that surround our rib cage, surround our abdomen, and at the bottom of our pelvis. This eccentric or lengthening component is what allows stability and control of that canister to take place so that we don't end up distending or overpressurizing things too much. During exhalation, that's when the diaphragm recoils or rebounds back up to push the air out of the lungs. It creates a contraction or a concentric mechanism of the rib cage, the abdomen, and the pelvis. This eccentric and concentric balance that should take place throughout the breathing mechanism is critical for ideal health and movement of that respiratory system. If we lost over the course of time the ability or capability of that system to maintain that balance, then over the course of time the body's going to develop compensations, strategies, and behaviors it'll put into place to try and override that underlying mechanism, because the brain and the body are going to try to find the easiest way to do things 100% of the time. So I'd like to spend a minute or two and talk about the thorax. It's important to remember that the thorax is the top of the thoracic aperture to basically the top of the diaphragm, and everything below the diaphragm will be considered the abdomen. The thorax contains the rib cage as well as all the contents within the thoracic cavity, such as the lungs and the pericardial tissues. This thorax is incredibly dynamic, as I mentioned before, but it's important to recognize that the movements happen in many different directions depending upon the shape we take based upon the positions we're in during our daytime. As I take this rib cage and I were to rotate my upper rib cage and thorax this direction, there will be an associated counter rotation that takes place of this sternum as well as the lower part of the vertebrae in the opposite direction. Let me demonstrate. As I rotate this way to turn, this orients towards the opposite direction, and the bottom of the spine orients in the opposite direction as well too. So you'll have upper thoracic left rotation, but you'll have a rotational sequence that's taking place further down the length of the spine that's orienting these in the opposite direction. That's what allows rotation to occur. It's also important to notice what happens to the rib cage and how these ribs on this side, the leading edge of rotation, externally rotate on the front, creating internal rotation on the back. But that's not all across the entire front of that rib cage. As these externally rotate, as I rotate this way, can you see how these internally rotate? These have developed a downward orientation as these have arranged in upward orientation. And the opposite's taking place on the opposite side. So as these externally rotate and orient towards the left, as I go to rotate, these on the opposite side are going to be internally rotating and externally rotating on the top. That's what creates a dynamic rib cage's ability to be able to rotate, to throw, to swing, to reach and punch in various movements like this. If I don't have ideal, optimal, expansive qualities internally for this to occur, and ideal, optimally positioned structures externally and internally, then this rotational mechanism becomes compromised. And even for something as simple as gait, the ability of this rib cage to be able to go for a walk and have the thorax and pelvis work on the rotations that they need to allow for ideal alternation of the body on both sides becomes compromised. And then further compensations develop. With respect to breathing mechanics, there's another important element that I want to discuss. More than just the expansive and collapse and the gas exchange mechanisms that are critical, it's important to realize what's happening to our organs internally when we go through this breathing process. There's not a single system in our body that's the same on both sides. One might argue the skeletal system, but there's usually variations subtly side to side in the skeletal system as well. That being said, this beautiful asymmetric nature of all of our systems over the course of time can develop compensations. The body and brain begin to recognize that both things aren't happening evenly on both sides. How this affects respiration can be manifold. From a standpoint of overall mechanics of what happens internally, here's what I want to create a picture of. Movement that creates a spin or precession into a certain direction. During inhalation, as that diaphragm descends, recognizing and remembering that the right side of the diaphragm is more domed than the left, there's more attachments of the crura onto the right side of the spine than the left, creating a more powerful mechanism for that right hemidiaphragm to become a little bit more active and better positioned. It has the support of a liver underneath it, which is the second heaviest organ in the body behind our skin. That aids giving it extra support for it to become a more powerful breather. With respect to our visceral structures, there's a mechanism that creates spin or precession, as I talked about. There's subtle movement of these guts as we inhale during inhalation and exhalation. This spin that takes place is critical for us to be able to function ideally. However, the body and brain are constantly trying to manage this spin at the same time. Sometimes we do a pretty good job of it. Other times, not as much. The body will also take on positions and orient itself and arrange itself to offset this. There's a great analogy that I got from Bill Hartman that talks about standing in a stream. And if I stand in the stream with my feet planted, and I picture a gentle current coming from my right side, how that's constantly pushing me in this direction. That's what I want you to think about with regards to this organ arrangement. What I'll be doing over the course of time is developing compensation strategies to offset this current. I'll have a tendency to anchor down on my right side a little bit more. Makes it easier to be able to hold myself against the flow of water. I'll stiffen myself up or overextend myself to tense things up to offset the pull of that current. And if I'm ambulating and doing movements, I'm going to have a tendency to load myself more towards this right side to offset the flow that's happening as these organs and structures are being rotated towards the left. So I'll have a tendency to be anchoring myself upstream when I walk, which is what we'll often see with people when we analyze gait. We want to create this dynamic rib cage, pelvis, abdomen, canister that's going to balance off this internal flow so that we don't want to restrict it from occurring. We just want to balance it out as much as possible. And that's what these next couple activities will hopefully begin to demonstrate for you. What we want to try and do is get a balance of the chest and the abdominal region and the pelvic to all expand roughly evenly at the same time. When we inhale, we should be inhaling through our nose. As we exhale, during this technique, we want to have people breathe through their mouth. Exhalation through the mouth allows for a slower, longer, fuller exhalation, which allows the body to be able to take the rib cage and the diaphragm and bring them to a better starting position for that next inhalation. My hands are merely monitoring where I feel expansion occurring through my chest and rib cage, as well as feeling like I'm getting some expansion into my pelvis at the same time. A couple thoughts related to this technique. Number one, exhaling longer, slower, and fuller than one normally would, and pausing during that end exhalation. That pause allows time for the tissues and structures to get to a nice relaxed position to aid in optimal orientation for the next inhalation. Two, feeling like expansion occurs into the pelvis, the abdomen, and the upper chest region all should happen roughly at about the same time. While air is only going into the lungs, there should be expansion across our abdominal cavity as well as our pelvic cavity, as our body's pushing our guts and organs down into these regions during inhalation. That expansion is what allows the body to be able to create the pump that it needs for that next exhalation. The next activity is done on hands and knees. In this position, your body maintains a comfortable position, not overly rounded and definitely not collapsed. In this position, you take one arm and you bring it up in the air, and what you're doing is bringing your elbow up towards the ceiling to rotate your trunk and torso. In this position, you take 3 big breaths. just like you did when you were lying on your back. Pause, inhale. And then switch sides. By having the arm in the air, you've taken your rib cage and you've rotated it. And now you've taken the internal structures and you've exposed other areas for optimizing expansion and optimizing exhalation for muscle control following. I'd recommend 3 breaths, 3 times on each side, after performing the exercise on your back. The second activity I like for respiratory health is done sitting in a chair. A kitchen chair or dining room chair usually works fairly well because it has a backing to it and is usually a little bit stiffer. Facing the table and sitting a little forward on the seat, you take one arm and press it towards the table, and you take the other elbow and press it back into the chair. This has created this little bit of rotation through my rib cage in this position. By gently pressing through my elbow and through my hand, I take 4 to 5 slow, easy breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth, blowing out more air than I normally would, just as we had done initially. This change in orientation of the body exposes new areas of the rib cage and lungs to expand, as well as optimizes muscle control around the rib cage to aid in this rotational movement. 4 to 5 deep breaths in through the nose, blow out more air than you're used to, 3 on each side. Our lymphatic system should be considered the plumbing of our body. And by plumbing, I mean it's designed to flush fluids out and out of our system most effectively. There are regions that are hotspots where lymph nodes are that allow this to take place, but it can be stimulated a number of different ways. I'm going to demonstrate 2 different activities that I find very helpful to optimizing lymph fluid movement. 1 by using gravity to assist, and 2 by using perturbations or bouncing to assist this process. We're going to use airflow and respiration, much like the first time, to be able to allow optimal pumping internally while we try to stimulate these regions of the lymphatic system. At home, you take a couple pillows and place them underneath your hips, so your hips are higher than your chest. In this position, gravity will now be helping this process of flow through the body. You'll stay in this position for 6 to 8 breaths, in through the nose, blow out longer and fuller than you normally would, and then pause. This is allowing the chest and upper back to expand. Gravity's aiding in the expansion not only of the lungs and rib cage, but also stimulating fluid flow superiorly into the structures that don't normally get it quite as much because gravity's limitation. This next activity involves a little bit of pumping. And what I like to have people do is to do a before and after when they do this one, because it demonstrates the power of it. If you stood with your feet about a comfortable distance apart and went down to go touch your toes, make a note of what that feels like and how far you're able to go. For those that have the capability of squatting, take a couple of easy depth squats and just see what it feels like to your body, the ease with which you can go up and down. Then lie on your back, feet are up on a wall, legs are less than 90 degrees, and you have very limited muscle activity, so I'm not tensing anything. In this position, you just take your feet and push onto the wall like this. I literally like you think about your guts are being shaken inside. Just like the other activities, in through your nose, out slow, full, and easy through your mouth. I tell people do this for 1 to 2 minutes, using the airflow as the pump, using the bouncing as the fluid flow, shaking up your insides to stimulate that lymphatic system. As people go to check themselves afterwards, many times they'll feel it's much easier to go down towards their toes, and squatting becomes a lot deeper and a lot easier as well. The third area I wanted to discuss was the movement system. The movement system comprises a number of different parts of the body. The reason it is so critical is because it helps to complement the first two regions we discussed, the respiratory system and the lymphatic system. It is through movement that our body is able to lubricate our joints, stimulate our muscles, and take in input from the ground and the environment around us. I'm going to demonstrate two different activities, one more supported and one group more unsupported, depending upon a person's individual capabilities. For those that need more support, sitting in a chair, on the front edge of the chair, feet are flat on the ground, preferably with shoes on your feet. You'll reach with opposite arms and legs, and at the same time allowing the thighs to rotate with you. So your body's going through this rotational pattern like this, even though your arms and legs are going in a straight line. This is simulating what the body does when we walk. It's allowing rotation to occur through a number of different joints, rotating our rib cage, and because we're breathing at the same time, it's stimulating that respiratory and lymphatic systems that much more. I have people slide forward and back through their arms and legs, side to side, as they get more towards the overhead position. Doing a little reaching while going side to side, allowing those thighs to continue to slide. Again, is optimizing movement and stimulating muscle activity as well as joints fluid flow. The second activity to be done supported would be a marching exercise. And now we're going to alternate. So now we have opposite arm and leg activity just as if we're walking. As my right arm comes up, my left leg comes up. As my left arm comes up, my right leg comes up. I have weight through my two sits bones on the front edge of a firmer chair. Same idea as before. Keeping that air moving, keeping the alternating arm movement taking place, is internally and externally allowing movement and pumping actions to occur. The two unsupported activities I'd like to cover based upon movement are a standing march with opposite arm and leg movement. In particular, as you cross your arms and legs just a little bit towards each other, that cross-body movement is stimulating not only rotation into a number of directions while I keep my air moving, but it's also stimulating brain health. Opposite arm and leg movement allows the brain on both sides to get inputs passing back and forth from one side to the other. And this little bit of rotation of the arms while lifting opposite legs allows this cross-brain and cross-body activity to be idealized. 10 to 15 repetitions on each side, deliberately keeping your air moving. The second activity that is ideal brings us back to infantile stages. Crawling. Crawling is a very basic movement that takes place that allows the body to be able to create muscle stimulation, feedback from the ground, but also be able to create an alternating activity that idealizes muscle work. I'll have people start in a position where the same side hand and leg are close to each other, the others are farther apart, and then literally crawling by opposite arm and leg as you go from one end to the other. Those that have more strength, if you're able to get your knees off the ground, even better. It stimulates that much more muscle activity and optimizes that fluid flow and that respiratory, lymphatic, and movement health.
What I hope I've been able to accomplish with this webinar is create a backdrop on the influence that the big three systems can have on both recovery and sleep. By tapping into the respiratory, lymphatic, and movement systems, one can develop powerful tools that can aid in overall health, especially since they each feed into each other. Optimal respiratory health relies on having full respiratory excursion and expansive and contractive capabilities to be able to remove CO2 and mucus from our lungs. As upright bipedal humans, we're more biased towards inhalation, so as a result, the activity's biased more towards exhalation with pause in order to be able to create this effective pumping technique. A healthy lymphatic system relies on the ability of pumps and suction to be able to move fluids effectively through our tissues for optimal cellular health, as well as develop a strong immunological response. The movement system affects these other two systems as it's able to help by pumping things further through the contractive natures of muscle activity as well as joint movement. Sleep disordered breathing affects tens of millions of people, and it's been estimated that 90% of people remain undiagnosed who have signs and symptoms. Not being able to reach all 4 phases of sleep, including deep REM, can have a profound influence on overall health. The techniques we reviewed help to stave off the influence of poor breathing patterns that can happen overnight, as well as reduce the potential risk of apnea, as that becomes a critical health issue for people who have it. These were low threshold based activities because we're trying to tap into the autonomic nervous system to create a more parasympathetic response versus a more sympathetic one, as would be accomplished with more higher threshold activities, such as during training. We want to be able to help to down-regulate the system, to bring it out of its more overactive, overstimulated, stressed state, to develop strategies that allow it to optimize recovery, sleep, and therefore overall health. Thank you for your time. To your health.